Well, good evening. It's an honor to be introducing tonight's speaker, also the first pair of the four parts series. It's my second year to be part of this selection jury. And it's been incredibly rewarding because, as a past winner myself, you always wonder what really constitutes and what makes the voice heard, what really makes the voice emergent. From my personal experience, it's been surprisingly quite even once you are seeing this, 20-something portfolios amongst the group of people in the room, that the voice that really resonates are quite commonly agreed between all the jurors. I want to share a little bit of how I came to, during those jury sessions, to find Model Studio and Future Green. Future Green Studio, I think I didn't know about. They were also part of the selection process last year. I did not know them before I entered the room, but I knew their work by just walking around New York City. I started to notice from a few years ago that there's this weird, moments that was joyful and it was very, it was surprising and it caught me in, by this kind of spontaneity and a kind of joyfulness around the city. Canopies suddenly have the hole, and you have greens that falls from above to under, and sometimes you see, windows that suddenly get taken over by greens around them. So last year when I first saw their portfolio, I just had a smile on my face. I'm like, oh, now I know what's happening, who are responsible for these moments that I keep encountering in the city. And with Model Studio, I personally don't know Arkansas so well, as you can maybe imagine, as a foreigner. And, it was very difficult for me to judge in the beginning what their work, how they played into the context of the Arkansas architecture kind of discipline. But then the more I look at their trajectory and history, they started in 2008, the same moment that we started our office. Although we wanted emergent voice earlier, but admittingly, they have achieved much more buildings than we did. and they built with consistencies. And I remember one of the jury, I don't remember who it was, said, wow, these guys are just quietly like a tornado taking over Arkansas. And that's really what they did, I think. I would like to maybe read two sentences from their philosophy that they submitted, that after kind of encountering their work, it really resonated. From Future Green Studio, they said, as careful observers and good listeners, our approach to the design process begins with detailed observation of what's already happening on that site and the close communication with clients and communities. In that way, we unearth inherent value and beauty. And from Model Studio, they say that we believe that through observation, the world reveals itself as an inspirational primer for design and an unwritten instruction manual for living. Both of them resonated with me and reminded me of this phrase by Henri Lafleur in 1931. In which, in a book that he published called La Conscious Mystery, says, how are we to proceed in order to effect a necessary rehabilitation of the mystified consciousness? By starting with the portrait of the most prosaic of men in his everyday life. I think what I saw in both of this studio's work was a quiet but revolutionary moment that is very much convincing and joyful, but also a believer in this unsettling time. Let's face it, we're living in a very divisive moment. There are tensions between different ideologies, cultures, genders, local and the global. they exist, contradictions and tensions, but there's also a wholly new possibilities for new narratives. And from the hubris of the human act, I feel that the two of them showed us really this possibility of a quiet revolution. And I would like to end my introduction with one of my favorite quotes from Mary Shelley, who said, "Invention, it must be humbly admitted, does not exist in void, but does not consist in creating out of the void, but out of chaos." So without further ado, I would like to hear how they do it from these two winners.
Hello, my name is David Seiter with Future Green Studio. Thank you so much, Chris. So much of what you spoke about really resonates with me personally. I think you'll find some commonalities between the studios, which I hope will come through the presentation tonight. I think where you ended, Chris, is probably where I'll start. And just saying some thank yous. First off, thanks to the Architectural League and Anne for being here. It's such an honor. I know it's landscape architects are kind of not frequently chosen, and so it's great to be kind of part of that club and be a part of the league. I just wanted to say thank you to my family, just the ability to kind of get here. My mom flew in tonight, my wife, my children, and Future Green is really a familial place. Happened to work with my best friend from growing up, David Goldberg. Aaron Boer, our associate principal, and I went to grad school together, and a number of our associates who have been with the firm for quite a while, Nadine, Nancy, Tyler, Jay, Lois. There's been so many valuable contributors over the last 10 years, and it's just an honor to be here. So thank you so much. Future Green Studio, we were founded in 2008 in Brooklyn. We are a collection of designers, artists, makers, horticultural experts, construction managers that come together to realize unique projects and kind of bespoke elements within the urban landscape. Over the past 10 years, we've slowly grown as a firm and created a number of projects, which we've really begun to understand as a series of kind of patches throughout the city. And I'll speak to that as I kind of go through the presentation. Many of the interventions were extremely small scale. And through this kind of process of designing and building, been able to really research and experiment through our projects to realize these goals. So a lot of our process really starts with observing and kind of understanding, trying to understand what's happening within our urban landscape. I think we all agree, this is not a northeast deciduous forest, right? The conditions that we've created in our cities are radically different than anything else. And so in order to design landscapes within that environment, we really wanted to look and understand where are plants kind of spontaneously occurring? Where are these things naturally taking root? What are those conditions? What are the substrates that we then can kind of understand as this kit of parts? So by integrating this kind of performative design into the built environment, we can really create this patchwork ecology. And so a lot of our observation is just through a number of different processes, one of which is taking photos. So you can see a kind of collection of those images and the various conditions with which those plants have emerged. And then we really try to take those and then translate those into the built environment. So you'll find window boxes and green walls and kind of small scale courtyards, planted canopies over the entrances of buildings, things that colonize the roofs, the walls, the lots, the kind of streets, all the kind of underutilized spaces throughout the city. So our practice really sits at the intersection of design. This is the Brooklyn Children's Museum. Research, our book on spontaneous urban plants, which was published last year. Fabrication, the Metropolitan Museum Art, a collaboration that we did with the artists Dan Graham and Günter Vogt. Community. This is a local kind of pop-up garden that we collaborated on with Gowanus Canal Conservancy and Alloy Development to put these kind of container gardens throughout Gowanus, Brooklyn. It's called the 2,000 Gallon Project, where essentially meant to illustrate about the stormwater retention capacities of these gardens. And then revisioning, trying to think about as our cities really shift and get denser and more people are kind of living within them, how can we really re-envision what our cities are going to be like 20, 30, 40 years from now, and make them both ecologically performative but also livable. So I'm also going to kind of take a step back and look at the early years of Future Green. It is a kind of unique story in the way that we kind of emerged, and I think coincides a lot with the way that we look at the urban landscape. So this was our studio from 2009 to 2012. You see the kind of ivy on the building. There's this little kind of two-story 20 by 20 little space that we operated out of, and then a 6,000 square foot yard. It had been a kind of asphalt strewn lot, and essentially it was at a unique time, I think. In 2008, obviously a lot of things had happened. This building had went into litigation over its foreclosure, and so really the building sat empty for about 5 years. So through a friend, we were able to become kind of caretakers of the building. And so for 3 years, operated out of this massive building that was essentially otherwise vacant. But what it did was it gave us the opportunity to really experiment and play around. So this is from the roof, kind of looking down on our yard, very rough around the edges. But it gave us really the opportunity to play. So we grew our own food. We grew our own plants. We tested different green roof plants, thinking about which ones would really function in these shallow soil depths. We even took the post-industrial soil from the lot and brought it up to the roof, and then did what's called essentially a brown roof, kind of looking at through a very thin soil application of 2 inches, what would emerge there, what plants would just kind of come, and then created these little bird nesting habitats. So it was really a place of play and experimentation, and the kind of void that was created in 2008 gave us the opportunity really to experiment and develop this kind of foundation of ideas. So one of the first projects around weeds was this Profiles of Spontaneous Urban Plants. And essentially we were just looking at the plants around us. We were plant people. And it was, I almost kind of at one point just felt like, how can I not know all of these plants that are all around me if I'm interested in plants, but yet I don't know the names, I don't know where they came from, I don't know the histories. And so what we did was this kind of two-part art project where we highlighted the weeds in front of our office as a way of kind of distinguishing them to the passerby. And in a way, through photography, kind of elevating their status. And then at the same time, we photographed plants from the yard, bare-rooted, researched their cultural histories, their habitat preferences. And, it's amazing. These plants came from all over the world. Many of them were native, to New York. But they all had these really rich histories that were intertwined with cultural history and social history. And so, that was really engaging. And so we wanted to use this style of representation that you'd almost find, traditionally used with like lavender or hydrangea or things that are might find on somebody's kitchen wall, something that's traditionally pretty. And by that method of representation, again, kind of elevate the status of these plants. Not to say that all weeds are wonderful, but to make people kind of question their preconceived notions about the plants that they just walk by every day and don't notice. That then took on Another form a couple of years later, this project, hashtag spontaneous urban plants. It was for a D3 natural systems competition. And so the idea here was to use the platform of Instagram and your phone to be able to map plants throughout the city and create this kind of user-generated database of weeds. So we went out as a studio throughout the 5 boroughs, these kind of open-ended transect walks inspired by, Guy Debord. And the Situationists to kind of explore the city in an open-ended way that we allowed, plants to kind of push us and pull us through the space, not setting out like with a particular trajectory. So it's using the inspiration of plants to begin to create these kind of transect walks across the city. And through that process, and again, using your phone and Instagram, you're able to kind of use the geolocator feature of that to map the location of the plant. So we had data and we had its location, and we were able to kind of use that to generate this database. And so at the same time, we started to look at the different conditions, diagram out like where these different conditions were occurring. Are they pockets? Are they armatures, porous surfaces, or seams? All of which are, again, kind of looking at the conditions in the substrate. Then how can we kind of, through a series of processes of addition, optimization, subtraction, or replication, kind of work and augment those existing conditions and make them, again, into these kind of built environments, right? So just beginning to kind of play with this idea of how can we take those systems and then translate them to our urban environment. And the idea of designing with subtraction, for one, was extremely interesting to me. And so, that's something that you'll kind of see take on form throughout some other projects. The project then took a turn towards a website. So we were able to use the Instagram-generated data to create this, again, user-generated database of weeds. So you're able to sort by plant type. You're able to sort also by ecosystem services. This is wildlife habitat. So, I'll talk about this a little bit more, but each of these plants also offers a performative value to the city. I do think, though, that hairy crabgrass is probably not the best ambassador for weeds, but it is something that you find growing everywhere, and it's a kind of ubiquitous plant that we all just pass by. But in its prostrate condition, growing up between the cracks of the pavement, serves a valuable benefit to slow stormwater. Its seeds offer wildlife habitat, and so it creates a kind of host of benefits. And then that allowed us to do a series of kind of outreach walk and talks with a local public school here, or local organizations, universities, where, again, we're trying to generate discourse. We're not trying to be didactic and say that everyone should start paying attention to these plants, but the reality is that a lot of them offer, all sorts of benefits that we really need to take a closer look at. So this project kind of culminated in our book, Spontaneous Urban Plants, Weeds in New York City. So there's a short kind of flip through of the book. It included a series of kind of wanderings and mappings, and then an index of 50 plants that are kind of based upon their ecological service that they offer. So again, just coming back to this, our approach really integrates this kind of observation of the urban environment, and then we look at how that we can then translate that into these built typologies that take the forms of, green roofs and window boxes and planted parapets and courtyards, thickets and urban meadows. Those then contribute these really vital ecological and human services to create these more livable and resilient cities. So, this is a kind of ecologist tool of the way that they would apply a lens to any plant. So we've just kind of adapted that and used that to spontaneous urban plants. So our approach. So large parks and preserved lands are traditional components of the urban landscape. These are often overlooked, but more ubiquitous are the opportunities found in walls, roofs, lots, and streets. These smaller scale interventions, when stitched together, contribute to the ecological performance and livability of the city. So I'm going to begin to kind of look at a series of our projects through these kind of different surfaces. So walls, 41 Bond, a project that we did with DDG partners. The facade of the building is all bluestone. So some of our early investigative work was a trip to Tompkins Bluestone Quarry in Ithaca, New York. And bluestone is a sedimentary material, and the way it kind of lays out, there's all these kind of fissures and cracks in the walls and kind of plants emerging from those rock faces. And so we were able to really collaborate. This is our second project with DDG, but really able to kind of collaborate on finding ways of integrating green into the facade and into the built form in unique ways. So there's 24 integrated window boxes, ground floor loggia, and then planted canopy. And so, what was unique about this project, it's a north-facing facade. The window boxes are recessed to the facade so they don't get any natural rainfall. It needed to kind of look effortless, I think, but yet it also needed to function. And so that included, integrating irrigation and drainage into the facade. It's all controlled by a central manifold in the basement. And finding ways of creating a planting design that was really legible from the street, so it becomes like a street garden. But at the same time, these are individual people's bedrooms, and there needed to kind of be a more stronger sense of kind of intimacy with the plants, that these things really registered as kind of soft and almost like specimen-like qualities, again, outside people's bedrooms. So, what we've then created was this kind of vertical garden in the city. And, tried again to kind of find all these different surfaces with which to stitch in green. Another project that looks at wall surfaces is Atlantic Plumbing in Washington, D.C. with Morris Adjemi. So again, a lot of our investigation really starts at the site. It's really our intention to not bring a strategy to a project, but to really unearth the project by kind of examining the existing conditions and revealing the kind of latent conditions within a site. So here again, we're kind of looking at the existing plants on site. We end up creating this kind of 100-page index of all the different weeds that we found on site. We kind of documented the location, their height, their breadth, and kind of thought about their value to the project. Not that we would be able to preserve any of them because the building footprint was really taking the large part of the site, but that we could use these as inspiration for our own planting design. And so we explored a number of strategies to weave in green into the building. One of the most kind of dramatic installations were these 6 300-foot-long window boxes into the western facade. And then there's all sorts of planted green roofs and other green features to the building. But so again, using the initial plants that we found, trying to come up with landscape varieties that are locally sourced and available that were derivative of those different species, to really create, again, this kind of robustness. Again, this, like 41 Bond, has a big maintenance component to it. How do you kind of, access these throughout the year, begin to maintain them? We really have to think through all of those systems as we're pitching these to our clients. And so, again, these are situated outside people's living spaces. We wanted to create this sense of kind of biophilia that you're really wrapped within the green. And yet these really need to be low maintenance landscapes. So it's basically a lot of grasses and perennials. They stay in the kind of 2 foot to 3 foot range. So there's kind of this beautiful carpet at your feet, but then all your views kind of open up to the distant city horizon. So again, shots of that western facade and then the third floor kind of green roof. And then again, we tried to create all these different moments throughout the building where green kind of comes into your eye line from the interior. So at the third floor terrace, these kind of little seating moments with green screens that really register outside the interior amenity spaces. Building lobby kind of entrances with these long linear planter boxes that kind of greet you upon your entry into the building. Rooftop tenant farms This is actually managed by a farmer, and they run all sorts of events up here. It's a 400-unit building, so they're able to kind of program in it in a lot of really fun ways, holding dinner events and happy hours up here. And then kind of a lot of built-in elements to create these spaces that integrate planting and seating and create a kind of series of spaces within the building. Another project that looks at walls is our collaboration with Zaha Hadid Architects for the 520 West 28th Street here in New York, not too far away from here. A lot of what our kind of early research and precedent imagery really looked at fracturing. We wanted to kind of think about the kind of natural wall formations and how we could begin to articulate that in a more contemporary form. And so here we've got a 30-foot high by 100-foot long integrated green wall. These are kind of these little plant slivers and pockets of plants that pour out of the green wall itself. And we wanted to play up the kind of lushness and kind of naturalness, I don't think that's a word, of the space, and really think about the size and texture of the plants. So there's a lot of ferns, there's a lot of large leafed plants, and then there's a lot of plants which kind of draw on like prehistoric roots that, you know, kind of timeless. So it's almost like a kind of grotto-like condition. But the actual construction was extremely complicated. This one we did not build, we just designed. But we worked with a fabricator in Mexico called Kinetica who does really amazing work. So this is all made of FRP, and it was all kind of again, kind of digitally designed, and we went through a series of kind of mock-ups to get to this point, including a kind of trip to Mexico to visit the modules and look at the color and look at the construction. And it was a very complicated system, again, to kind of integrate, you know, irrigation and drainage and do something that I think none of us had ever really done before. And so this project was installed this last fall, so we're still waiting to get it photographed later this year. You can see some of the construction installation shots, the large leaf magnolia tree kind of being installed, see a lot of the ferns, and then the real kind of heavy frame and construction that goes into creating something like this. So rooftop projects are obviously a big component of any kind of urban landscape, but I think, again, that's rather something new. You know, it's really something that we've seen post 2008 really kind of take on form as this new kind of typology within landscape architecture, and it almost aligned with green infrastructure and some other kind of performative landscapes like that. So this is Empire Stores in Brooklyn Bridge Park, a collaboration with S9 Architecture. So again, this is kind of looking at the historic photo of the site. It was an old coffee warehouse where all the coffee came into Brooklyn from. Huge, kind of massive building, really situated at the north end of Brooklyn Bridge Park, between the Brooklyn and Manhattan bridges. So the building itself was low and broad and massive, and it really anchored the northern edge of the park. But, you know, at the same time, the architects wanted to introduce this kind of cut into the building. And we found that the cut really mimicked the shoreline and related to the shoreline. So we wanted to use that as a strategy, and then also the kind of framing views of the bridges to create and kind of abstract this form from the river's edge. So we used this kind of extraction of the riprap in front of the building to create these kind of distinctive planter benches which organize the fifth floor public terrace. So overall, there's, you know, roughly 70,000 square feet of green roof on the building, all sorts of different commercial spaces, including West Elm's new headquarters. Brooklyn Historical Society has a small kind of museum outpost there. We're working with Soho House to do the 6th and 7th floor terraces. But for us, the real fun part of the project, in addition to all those roof spaces, was this kind of fifth floor public terrace. So there, again, we use that kind of riprap idea to kind of form these sculptural island planters. They're wrapped in diamond plate steel. It's a traditional New York material that we see often on the front of buildings and then kind of kicking out over sidewalk vaults. So it's a material that kind of wraps from surface to ground. And so we wanted to use that as a strategy to kind of play out underneath the benches. Again, using kind of reclaimed wood from the building itself to create these dramatic kind of chaise lounges. So you see how the diamond plate is the kind of base of the bench itself and then kind of kicks out as a floor tread. Simple kind of parapet bar, installations. There wasn't a lot of, we wanted to create a kind of lot of fixed elements on this project to allow it to be this kind of eventscape. But then, we used what clients asked for was a green roof, right? Which I think a lot of people think now is like a sedum-based kind of application. But what we look to do is kind of take any of those traditional moves of green roof and see how we can kind of amplify and optimize that. So again, drawing on our experience of studying urban adapted plants, we wanted to create something that create a lot of volume out of the green roof. So we're working with roughly 6 to 8 inches of soil here, but we're able to get 3 to 4 feet out of volume out of the plants. And then at the ground floor, one of the things that we can do as part of our fabrication studio, I should have mentioned we designed, built, and maintained 41 Bond, Atlantic Plumbing, and Zaha Building we did not. But this project, we were able to really customize certain pieces. So at the ground floor in front of the Cicconi's restaurant, we were able to do these blackened cedar planters and partitions. Again, kind of presenting this kind of face to the project. So another roof that we worked on is 345 Meatpacking, again with DDG. So this is what the Meatpacking looked like in the late 80s, early 90s. And in the early days of the High Line, you could get up on and you could see how these gravel ballasted roofs had like little plants kind of coming out of them. And so that was a real inspiration. Again, this came after 41 Bond with DDG, where we explored that kind of planted canopy. And we were able to apply that in a marquee condition to the whole length of the building. So it becomes a kind of 50-foot long by 10-foot wide kind of installation. Again, hopefully looking effortless, but yet went through a kind of lot of engineering to produce. So our process really starts through looking at, again, unique ways we can look to integrate green into the built environment, and then through a careful calibration and study of plants and seasonality, right? Every garden that we create, is really inhabited by people all year round. So we really want to think about the seasonality of the garden and how we can kind of weave in color and texture through a kind of orchestration of plants that emerges at different times and creates these kind of dramatic moments within people's days or seasons. So this planted canopy kind of drapes through these kind of amoeba-like kind of openings. We design the roof to have soil which undulates from 2 inches to 20 inches. It mounds up to accept some of the smaller tree material, which we planted relatively small, but yet in the last kind of couple of years it's really filled into kind of 15-foot high trees. And attracted retailers like Sorrel and Columbia and brands whose kind of ethos kind of mimic this performative green approach. And then as the plants drape through, these are clematis, but there's even kind of moonflower vines in there that open up at night. So this thing is not just like a season to season kind of orchestration of plants, but even within the day, moonflowers open up in the evening when the meatpacking district is really kind of bumping. And so there's even a kind of an ephemerality that landscape can bring to a person's day. This is the fall season with the sumac, and it is something that I think, as Jing mentioned, is a surprise, and people are kind of wondering like where did that come from, and looking at its kind of like public contribution to the streetscape. And then, through small-scale spaces, we're able to kind of integrate green, taking our traditional parapet where you just do block, up. How about we just stop that, 12 inches short and find ways of slipping in planters, waterproofing it, getting water there, draining it. All those technical things can be concealed in hopefully effortless ways. And then the penthouse gardens, all sorts of mechanical systems are now moving to the roofs of buildings. So you have these huge, bulkheads and kind of potential obstructions. So we, again, wanted to use that as an opportunity to create a garden. And so using this galvanized pit grading and then weaving 3 types of vines, we're able to kind of create this dramatic kind of vertical garden. At the Brooklyn Children's Museum, which we completed, designed and built and completed earlier this year, it was a collaboration with Toshiko Mori Architects. This is their open-air pavilion that is stitched into Raphael Vignoli's kind of 90s building of the Brooklyn Children's Museum. And so we were tasked with this kind of creating the furniture and the garden experiences underneath this canopy on this 20,000 square foot rooftop garden. And so for us, the way that the canopy was situated, you can see it in light gray there, it just naturally kind of played itself out that we wanted to create a series of quadrants of, in the upper left, native woodland, the lower left, this kind of open, flexible green space for exhibits or performance, the lower right, the lounge area, and then the upper right, dining area. These look to kind of stitch into the interior building programs, but also take advantage of some of the natural site conditions and shading opportunities that might be available. So a lot of our work really looks at program. Obviously, we're dealing with a lot of urban spaces that are highly used and often flexible from one day to the next. So we imagine what these spaces might be, from a kind of wedding on the lower right with all these 10 top tables on a Saturday night, to a kind of a weekend play space on the lower left, where kind of kids take over the next morning. So everything had to be stackable, foldable, storable, but yet we are also wanting to create these larger kind of gestures that hold the site together and provide these kind of anchors of green space underneath the canopy. So one idea was to explore this idea of natural play. A lot of our research for this included a trip to Prospect Park in the natural exploration area that was created with trees that were felled from Hurricane Sandy. And it's just this idea that, you really want to get kids away from rubber surfacing and having everything be safe, and kind of introduce them to natural elements. I think a lot of kids grew up in New York City not really knowing that dirt exists underneath all the pavement. So getting the tactile experience to natural materials and creating this kind of more immersive experience. So it started with the fabrication of this deck woodland walk. And you can see it realized here, taking its cues from almost like a state park to create these kind of little details and ways of slipping the user through these kind of more lush green spaces, but then providing these opportunities for play. You see the canopy here in the foreground and the woodland garden in the back. And then it really became this theater for all sorts of different programs. This is a drumming festival that took place up there, but there's been all sorts of different events, for political speeches, other kind of community gatherings or other kind of events. And, the anchor of the green space coupled with the kind of flexibility and movability of a lot of the furniture creates this real kind of dynamic balance. So we're also really interested in exploring lots. We happen to live and work in Red Hook, Brooklyn, which is, kind of at the fringes of the city and has a lot of kind of open spaces. So we were drawn to, Red Hook for its kind of open space, its sky, its light, its air, but also the kind of rugged qualities and the kind of vast open spaces that were there. One project that we had the opportunity to work on was Nowadays, which is a performance venue and beer garden in Ridgewood, Queens. This is the way we found the site. It was, again, kind of 18,000 square foot triangular site, rubble strewn, kind of former parking lot, but yet there was all sorts of plants kind of growing there. Things like ailanthus and mugwort and knotweed, all your traditional kind of plant invaders, right? And so we wanted to kind of use as an opportunity to create this really unique space. The space was kind of a temporary space. They had a 10-year lease on the site. It was owned and operated by 2 DJs that run a really fun dance party on Sunday evenings from like 3 to 10. You should go. You could bring your kids. It's a really kind of backyard informal kind of space and a really kind of legendary Brooklyn DJ party. So the idea was to create this kind of grid of trees over the site, grid of honey locust trees, which created this lush canopy that provided filtered, kind of dappled sunlight. But that's formed, harkened back to kind of DEP, state reclamation sites, where grids were used as a kind of planting strategy, and where plants were used for their performative qualities, often to absorb toxins and heavy metals from soil. So honey locust has phytoremediating properties. And this site, in addition to us kind of capping it with gravel, and a kind of decomposed stone dust, we did a lot of kind of thinking about plants which could also, in a passive way, slowly kind of remediate the existing soil. So the grid of honey locust trees is all around this kind of central dance floor, and then there's these 3 earthen mounds which provide this kind of backdrop to the space. So you can see the grid of honey locust trees, string lights, and then pops of color. This kind of weedy landscape that was really inspired by the existing site features. The site, I should also note, abuts along its longest side, the CSX rail line. And so we wanted to use that backdrop as an opportunity. So taking a page from the artist Caterina Grossa, who does a lot of painted landscapes. We painted a lot of the weedy shrub and dead tree material that was adjacent to the site. And it provides these kind of really fun moments that people didn't even necessarily realize when they first get there. But as they kind of wander over, kind of see these glimpses of this, spontaneous and playful landscape. Again, we think a lot about program, and so how can this space really flex from Friday night movie to Saturday night dance party to Sunday afternoon lunch? So again, we're always thinking about these kind of kit of parts and how they can adapt and change to the different uses that our urban spaces are required to offer. And so you see how that program plays out. There's just simple picnic tables that are painted to give it a splash of color. Simple kind of bar setups again. You see this kind of wooden platform on the right that provides like informal ways of sitting. People get to sit up there cross-legged with a glass of wine, or they can dance there. During the dance party. There's ping pong, there's bocce, there's other kind of like little playful elements. The idea is that you're really, functioning out of someone's like backyard. It's a real kind of casual, friendly environment. Food trucks. And then here you can see we left a couple of the existing trees in situ. So there's a large kind of ailanthus tree coming out from the top of the the food truck, and then we planted the fence with a lot of quick-growing kind of successional species. These are black cottonwood, but other things like sumac and birch. And then these earthen mounds provide these really casual ways of, again, kind of inhabiting the site. You can really lay back and almost like you're in a park-like space. And then, obviously the dance party takes over and, they have thousands of people there and it's really like a hopping, fun environment. This is a Project 30 Journal Square in Jersey City that we did with Moore's Adjemi Architects. So, here, I don't know if anyone's familiar with Jersey City, but Jersey Journal, the newspaper, was the real reason that Journal Square got its name. And so we're interested in this building. The developer had bought this building as well as an adjacent site. And the intention was to tear down this historic building. And we felt like diving into the history of this thing, going to the local public library, we were able to find all these amazing records and historic photos of the building itself and the different spaces within it, and just felt like there's too much kind of history there to really let this go in its complete form. So how could we use that kind of existing frame of the facade of the building and create a kind of gateway to a new type of space? So here you're looking from Journal Square Plaza to the facade of the building, which we again kind of integrated with window boxes and kind of a planted facade, keeping the historic Jersey Journal sign and facade. And then what we did was we kind of 3D scanned the entire building and looked to keep the existing steelwork of the building itself. And so on the upper left, you see that kind of existing facade, which is punctuated with this plaza-like condition. This kind of promenade, which runs through these two one-story retail bars and becomes this kind of new office and residential plaza. A new real public amenity space within Journal Square. Journal Square is increasingly densifying, and yet there's very little park space available. And so we're excited to see this realized in the future. So a section cutting through the space, you see the existing facade work, the one-story kind of retail bar with green roofs, and then the kind of green columns that are anchored to the existing metal framework. So by keeping that, it not only allows us to keep some kind of memory or history of the existing building, but we're able to use it as an opportunity to create lighting armatures and plant armatures to create this more enveloped green space. And then, even where we are kind of truncating the columns or removing columns for various reasons, we're able to kind of use them in the paving as these kind of layers of memory throughout the site. So it becomes, again, this kind of flexible urban plaza space with integrated planters and benches and small performance spaces. And then one of our first projects, this was back in 2008, the first kind of big project I got, Casa Braid Factory, which is in Bushwick. And so this is Betty Smith, who wrote A Tree Grows in Brooklyn. This is outside of her house in Williamsburg with an ailanthus tree, which is kind of amazing. So the protagonist in the book, A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, worked in the Casa Braid Factory. And so we thought that was just a kind of amazing coincidence and used that as a kind of inspiration for the garden itself. So this 6,000 square foot courtyard becomes a kind of real social hub for the building itself. This was one of the first buildings to go up in the Bushwick neighborhood. It started a process of gentrification, but it also became a kind of artist enclave where there's all sorts of interesting programming and kind of social networking that happens within the building itself. And so we wanted to provide a kind of multiplicity of spaces within the building to offer up all sorts of different programming opportunities. But again, started with the kind of structure of the trees that provide this kind of dramatic canopy to the whole space. So this one is situated within a kind of frame that will be kind of covered with decking. And then these provide this kind of connection back towards the lobby, and then you can see the street beyond. So it was an intimate kind of garden, a small scale space, but one that is playful and incorporates a lot of kind of different ideas of, not necessarily having control over a project. We knew all these surfaces were going to be a part of a graffiti project, and so we created kind of certain blank surfaces within the garden that could be kind of augmented and changed as time went on. And then other elements that, kind of integrated benches and swing elements, again, to kind of play up the kind of social and fun aspect of the space. These integrated lights into the paving provide this kind of dramatic effect at night. Okay, so moving on to streets. This is another early project. This is from 2010, the MTA Plaza in Carroll Street in Brooklyn. And if anyone knows and has taken the F train, this is the point at which the elevated train dips down underground. So it's a kind of unique point within the city's fabric that we wanted to find a way of kind of highlighting. And so we were tasked with creating this kind of 3,500 square foot space in front of the building that we were asked to negotiate between a 4-foot grade change between a very private building entrance and a very kind of public subway entrance that gets 5,000 riders a day. And so we wanted to interpret that train going underneath the ground and then the reverberations that you actually felt on site by creating this kind of fractured or stepped landscape, again, to kind of negotiate that grade change. And then integrate paving that kind of radiated out from that kind of stepped garden and colonize the greater kind of corner of Smith and Second Place. So we designed and built this project working with a local steel contractor to do the metal work and really kind of create this stepped garden. And it's funny, people don't often admit mistakes, but in this project, all the paving lined up with all the metalwork, but I forgot to account for the width of the steel cladding. And so when we actually installed it, none of the paving was starting to line up with none of the paving. So if you actually look closely, one of the planters was cut and it's got an inch removed from it, but nobody knows. But the process of making things is not without mistakes, and that's how you learn, and that's how it's really through just we're going to design and build this thing, even though we've never done this before, process to really get things realized that you then can improve upon that in future projects. So it's kind of taking its form here. It provides like this really kind of great kind of neighborhood entry. And again, attracted, great retailers like Momofuku Milk Bar. And, this dramatic kind of planting design, which is kind of wild and overgrown, but yet softens the kind of more industrial materials. So one of the last projects I'm going to talk about is Half Street Pedestrian Plaza in Washington, D.C. This is a one-block pedestrian plaza in front of the Washington National Stadium. The site photo on the bottom is what it looks like now. So what we had the opportunity to do here was really create this new stitch within an emergent Capitol Riverfront neighborhood. So we looked at the existing L'Enfant plan and drew our kind of deep research into the geology and locally available granites around the site. And so what we're able to do is create this one-block pedestrian plaza in front of the stadium. It's a DC's first curbless street. It's also the first street that'll have catenary lighting over public space. And it really functions as a typical street most days, and then on game days, it gets closed at both ends and becomes this engaging kind of public plaza. So on the left-hand side, people exit from the metro station, and then kind of process down to the right, to the stadium on the right. And we wanted to use this super graphic of granite unit pavers to kind of bridge across the site and engage people, get people to really engage with the street itself. Did a lot of kind of material research and finding ways of using all sorts of different granite and concrete pavers. And then all sorts of ideas about taking traditional tree pits, 5 foot by 10 foot tree pit, and then smushing all of those together. So taking like the kind of components of a typical street, but just modifying it. So what we're able to do here is get these large, 11 foot by 40 foot long planters. So, which will be much more resilient on this kind of heavily trafficked site. So using the same ratios of planting to paving, but using it in a different way that offers more resiliency and also more kind of performative quality. These are all stormwater bioswales. They accept all the water from the street. So you see that there. So just in wrapping this up, I was really inspired by Commissioner Silver from the New York City Parks Department, where, he had said, parks represent 14% of the city's footprint, and streets and sidewalks is another 26%. That's 40% of the city that's in the public realm. So we see that as this unique opportunity. We see the streets are like, for me, the new frontier of urban public space. And so how can we find and utilize that realm and design that towards the public's good, not in just a social way, but in an ecological way? So thank you so much for the opportunity to share their work. It's truly an honor.